So I'll be talking about lettering, mainly focusing on the transition from traditional to digital lettering and the career of Todd Klein, an important figure in comic book lettering history, and one that's experienced both traditional and digital methods. So first, what is lettering? Pretty straightforward. It's the words that appear on a finished page of comics and the shape that encloses them. This also includes title lettering. Early comics lettering was done by the cartoonist and mainly appeared in all caps, as you've probably seen in the Smithsonian collection we have as a text. There was no real division of labor and no standard for making comics, so the job of a letterer was not really something associated with comics. Back then, you might call a person who wrote script a penman, engrosser, or calligrapher, like Jacob Challis, who inked the Constitution. Very early comics lettering was done in cursive, sentence case, really whatever the artist felt most comfortable in, because they were the one that drew the comic, they were the one that wrote the comic. They also had to letter it. With the advent of the Ames lettering guide in 1917, though, a tool that helped space lines evenly, artists began to plan their letters out more carefully. The Ames lettering guide was used in conjunction with a T-square to draw lines which you could put letters on. This tool was first used by engineers and architects for technical drawings, but it was also useful for comics. The lettering guide made it faster and easier to make professional grade lettering. Another thing to address is the common use of all caps in comics. This was common for two reasons. It was more legible because of the small text and high amount of reproduction that comics needed to go through, and because there were less spacing lines you need to draw for text. When drawing lowercase letters, you need a middle line or sometimes a line even below the bottom just to space the letters correctly and make them look legible and consistent. While most of the lettering in the early days was done by hand, a small minority of comics text was done by machine. It was nothing like the digital text of today, and it would be more like typesetting, what you would call it. Usually, this text was credited to a machine, mostly published from fonts by the Charlton Publications Typer, which was a typewriter used by small businesses that would allow you to set type the way you wanted. It was generally not very successful as a method of lettering, and while it was an attempt to cut corners to some degree, it ended up being more trouble than it was worth because it took more time and caused more errors. An example of this typewriter lettering can be seen in the Blue Beetle comic that I'm providing here. Another mechanical style of comic book lettering was done at EC Comics with a tool called the Leroy lettering set, another tool sometimes used by draftsmen for writing letters. It was essentially a straight edge ruler and a slider connected to a pen that you would use to trace letters that were engraved in the ruler part. It gave the letters a sort of half mechanical, half organic look. If you look back through the EC comics, you'll notice it. So let's move on to Todd Klein. Who is he? Why am I talking about him? Well, he's been a primary source for me during my research, so I'll include specific sources in the comments of my video, but if you look at them, pretty much all of them have information contributed directly by Todd. I'm also focusing on Klein specifically because he's done a lot of work in a pretty groundbreaking series. I'll list a couple, but you should really look online. He's done quite a bit. Some examples would be Fables, Sandman. He worked with Alan Moore on some production work and lettering for projects like Swamp Thing number 22 and the America's Best Comics ABC books. And he even did production cover of the Christopher Reeve Superman movie. His careers bridged the gap between traditional lettering and the now standard digital lettering, so I think he fit well for this presentation. A lot of the information I'll be talking about will be pulled from Klein's website, like I said, and therefore it has the potential to be filtered through his own perspective, but because his reputation is backed up by his contributions not only to published works but studies on lettering, I trust him. So Todd's early years were at DC Comics. He got his start there filling in for a vacationing employee in the production department doing art and lettering corrections and paste ups. The employee that he was replacing didn't end up returning, so Todd stayed, continuing to work at DC alongside John Workman, who got him started in lettering. Inspired by the lettering work of Gaspar Saladino, Todd continued to improve his lettering style and ability. After his career at DC, at which he worked from 1977 to 1987, he began a freelance lettering career. This is when he landed his job lettering Neil Gaiman's Sandman, which is still considered a groundbreaking work in the comics medium and for lettering in specific. If you look through Sandman, you'll notice a lot of different lettering styles. This book really shows the breadth of lettering knowledge Klein has. From there, he went on to team with Alan Moore on Supreme and the launch of America's Best Comics from Wildstorm DC. Todd also did some cover design for some of these ABC titles. In the mid to late 80s, when Todd was making his transition to freelance, computers began to introduce change as well. When the first Mac computer came out in 1984, one of its selling points was its word processor, which also contained a variety of different fonts. In 85, the next year, the first all-digitally created comic Shatter appeared, which used digital lettering before it was widely used commercially. The first published comic that used computer lettering was Flaming Carrot number 23. From the account of the designer, it was a bit of a mess because it was difficult to get proper kerning, the spacing between letters, in a digital medium. While this more goes along the realm of typesetting, it was a barrier for letterers to use the digital medium because letters would often look really wonky or weird due to the kerning. In the 1990s, Apple software was used more by letterers like John Byrne to make actually decent digital lettering. So in 1994, Todd Klein noticed this shift and bought his own Mac so he could begin creating his own fonts. Eventually, he worked with a company that helped him develop a template font he could expand on. This was Comic Craft. Klein fully adopted the lettering style in 1995 after sending fonts he made by hand to Comic Craft, who digitized them. From there, he was able to tweak them a bit or use them as templates to design more fonts, even including sound effect fonts. Nowadays, most lettering is done by digital lettering companies like Comic Craft and Blambot. As a final little pin for Todd's career, I'd like to mention that in 2002, Todd contributed the lion's share of the lettering section of DC's The DC Comics Guide to Coloring and Lettering Comics, collecting a 30-odd year working knowledge in lettering, which is pretty significant. So we're coming to the end of my presentation, and I'd like to quickly lay out a couple of the differences between traditional and digital lettering, just to summarize for you. I think they're both valid forms of lettering. And I think it's obvious why digital lettering is faster and cheaper, but it's good to note the differences because some traditional lettering is still done. One of the pros of digital lettering is that it looks standardized. There's not a lot of messing up you can do when typing a font into a computer. It's also faster. Traditionally, it would take up on the scale of a few days rather than a few hours to actually letter a page of comics. And along the same lines, it's really easy to change, either because of edits or translation, which are common things that will be needed to be applied to your comic. Because lettering that was done traditionally was placed between the penciling and the inking stage, you had to spend a little bit more time, and it would be harder to make changes once inking was done. Nowadays, you have the finished art and you can just place the letters right on top. Another pro to digital lettering is that it's cheaper, and actually it's easier to reproduce too, especially with title lettering. Elements can be used and adapted rather than starting from scratch each time. As for the pros of traditional lettering, arguably it has a little bit more personality. Digital lettering can lose some of that personality because it looks a little bit one note, but that really depends on your personal view and the specific application of the type. Another pro to traditional lettering is the freshness that you achieve because you can adapt to letter forms as you're writing them, because you can see little mistakes and use them for positive benefit. Traditional lettering has a little bit more of a fresh look. Another pro of traditional lettering would actually be roughness. This is the opposite of standardization, but it adds more personality to the actual writing, and sometimes it can make readers connect with the writing a little bit better. And possibly the most important pro of traditional lettering is that there's really an endless variety of letter forms that you can adapt due to the spontaneity of being able to write something on the page immediately. You're able to adapt, you're able to creatively improvise while drawing it, and so traditional lettering comes out a little bit more unique. Nowadays, most lettering is done digitally, with a few exceptions, like Graffiti's Wall, November, some others. I may sound a little bit down on digital lettering, I hope I'm not, but it's a logical and necessary step in the comics evolution process. We can see from the career of a distinguished letterer like Todd Klein that really no matter what style a letterer or artist will use, it's ultimately their artistic skill that determines the outcome of the finished product, and not the method that they're using.